Do 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 do. Extras.
The Nightmare Knight was a lot of work, considering they don't actually do much in this episode, but maybe they'll be back. And yes, the actual nightmare monster being ridden should be exhaling a big black concealing smoke cloud from his nostrils, but a realistically vision-blocking cloud would cover up the cool armor and wouldn't even be any less work for me unless I went way more cartoony than I want for this. Even though, theoretically, a good artist could make the black cloud look awesome with the nightmare's flaming highlights and the knight's glowing neck hole and weapon. If you're wondering why Little One reacts so strongly to the idea of Angel wielding the flaming weapon, it didn't quite make the overlong script, but the end of each of those flaming chains is shaped like a horned demon head, and certain players thought that was a step too far in the supervillain direction for her. I knew a huge amount of this episode was going to be spent staring at Kajor, so I spent a lot longer than on most previous orcs trying to refine his appearance. Whatever I did managed to get quite a bit of character into his face. Like, yes, there are a number of versions and expressions, but what amazes me is how effectively he seems to be emoting a lot of times just by moving his pupils from one side to the other. His armor was also described as the orc version of ornate, so I had to frig around a lot to get something which both fit in with Liz and Hag's crews and their armor of the desert, but which looked better, tougher, and had some detail. Then again, it was also supposed to be full plate, but I left his arms largely bare because he's also described as heavily muscled even for an orc, and he needs to show off those guns. I like that his bracers are asymmetric. One is just 3 teeth in a row, but the other has the teeth arranged in the old orc Ka symbol, matching the glyph that's all over his armor. Now, the original description didn't include the beard, as that's something I figured out more recently, but I do like the idea that I mentioned in the recent Shadowfell lore stream, that orcs don't grow facial hair normally, but when male orcs get on in the years, old age, for a species who rarely live past 60, they go through a process one could compare to menopause in female humans. In the orc's case, they go from no facial hair to fairly fast-growing facial hair, such that big bushy beards make them stand out among their peers as old and presumably tough and wise teachers. Mostly it just looks super badass. Though the beards still come in orc green, just like all TDDC orcs' natural hair color. It's possible it also tends to make them bald, since I think all my bearded orcs so far have been. One discussion that didn't make the episode was that the players were a little suspicious of his many scars after their experience with Del, so I had to make clear that while Kajor has a lot of scars by human standards, most of them were much older, healed as much as scars heal, and faded, rather than Del's Frankenstein mess. And injuries which caused scars like his looked much more plausibly survivable, so there was no reason to believe this was another monster in an orc suit. Of course, as proud as I am of Kajor's design, it had to do a lot of work, because with all the time I'd spent on a certain fancy animation in the post-credits, I did not want to do proper animation for his attacks or anything, and in the utter cheaping out area, I was not at all motivated to create proper flip versions, which he should have had due to his asymmetric elements. Plus, when I realized I needed to show him from behind, immediately, like the second I reopened the main project, because he's introduced facing away, I just absolutely didn't feel like redrawing the back of his fancy World of Warcraft boots. Like, I had a hard enough time making feet look not stupid already without having to do it twice. So, on all the occasions when he was facing away in full body, I stuck something, like a gnome's head, in front of his lower body so you couldn't see his hideous, totally non-reversed feet. As far as the actual battle, I wanted to edit it down because I don't like the huge amount of screen time spent on what we now know to have secretly been a puzzle fight all along. But there were a whole bunch of details I needed to include to convey their difficulties and their thought processes. Plus, there were a bunch of really good lines or other interactions I wanted to keep in the video, but which only made sense if I kept in other stuff, like Black's disarm attempt, which took even more time to explain, despite kind of going nowhere. In that case, if I cut out his disarm, you wouldn't know why he dropped his mace, and if he didn't drop his mace, you wouldn't know why he walked back into the giant orc's shadow to pick it up. I wanted to keep in all my shadow hints. And the fact that Black couldn't full attack after moving in there is why he used his standard action for a spell instead, which triggered the endgame. There was a bunch of slightly less critical stuff, which had a similar impact on funny or interesting dialogue, and it just made it really hard to cut down the fight. A few other quick points. Could they kill Kajord with damage? Nope. I was trying, with varying degrees of success, to make it more obvious that something was wrong the more damage they dealt. In the first round or two, that martial lore check was very difficult, but later on I was trying to let them know, and if the hit points hit 0, the illusion would have straight up glitched and stopped looking realistic at all, even as it kept attacking, hopefully forcing them to look for another solution. Didn't you just steal this fight from Neon Genesis Evangelion? Yes. Yes, I did. I came up with a way I thought it might work for D&D, but it is exactly the same idea. I'm not exactly a fan of NGE, but it had some very interesting ideas and great animation. I was pretty sure the guys hadn't seen it enough to spoil a fight. Why did the Albtrome drop a hint? They just can't help toying with these fools. They were so oblivious they still might not have got it. And if they didn't, even with the hint, think how sweet that victory would be. They're all going to die in the 5th challenge, anyway. Now, there's a tiny little detail in the episode. During a Kajord battle, one round, as the nature of the enemy began to be questioned, Angel goes off to search instead of attacking. But why does she run off to the left side of the map? The thing is, there was an encounter of sorts that happened during gameplay which I just straight up cut from the record, because it was kind of a mistake at the time, not very well thought out, nor did I execute the idea well. In the end, it didn't have much of an effect on the PCs, though you can see if you notice it in their choices in this or the next episode, and it would have made this section, which I already felt was too long, even longer while just muddying the narrative. The kind of thing I would just retcon away if I were writing some kind of adaptation of the campaign, which is what this is. So I did. Basically, when talking to Kajord in the second Conclave clearing, they, with somewhat malicious intent, convinced the orc to go take a swing at the keystone. But before the Albtrome showed up, Kajord starts in the direction of the keystone, but suddenly there's a flash of movement off to the left, swiftly followed by a loud crack and a number of trees falling over each other. Which stands out because up till now, every time the Albtrome has made an entrance, the trees have fallen neatly into place. And through the gap comes a figure you recognize. Cornello, leading his mist mount. Dude, we're busy!
We're trying to get the hell out of here. Why are you showing up and stuff?
Mora casts haste.
You.
Me? He looks at you, then to the orc, then back to you, and utters,
Zerdernoth.
His eyes glow green, but not much else happens.
Attack!
And I shout it out like that, so the orc will realize this guy's the threat.
This isn't part of the game. Al, whatever the hell your name is, this is supposed to be your realm. You're just gonna let somebody show up and disrupt your game?
I did say he was invited. Roll initiative, I guess.
1. Of course I rolled bad for this.
He's on 27. At this point, it doesn't matter. Cornello goes first, then everyone else.
I rolled a 20 last time, 1 this time.
Cornello mounts his mist horse. You can't have that horse too. Cornello mounts his horse and turns to mist as he disappears into the trees.
What did the eye thing do?
It allows him to gauge the life force of everyone he sees.
Like, how many hit points we have?
He wants to set up for power words. If you're under 100 HP, power word kill, you're dead.
That would fit some of Vladimir's, now his, shackles.
Okay, I can't take any damage then. Al? What's the name again? Albtrome. No wonder I can't remember it. Albatross? Are you just gonna let that guy disrupt your game? What? You think you're the only group I have on the go? I like to keep it interesting. Which reminds me, he appears next to the orc, who looks daggers at him. It occurs to me that I didn't get a chance to acquaint you with the rules here. Most of them you don't care about, but you also missed my initial offer. I can send you back home to your little desert. All you have to do is kill that scrawny hooded half-elf over there. Now, as you can see, I didn't have a good plan for this encounter. Realized partway in that as cool as it was in my head, it wasn't going to work out. and I bailed. So Cornello, who was clearly a fake Cornello, even in my so-called plan, bailed, having accomplished nothing other than delivering a tiny bit of dread and a big load of... Well, that didn't make much sense. The idea, in theory, was for fake Cornello to show up, use the Eyes of Aeronoth to assess everyone's health status, but it's really Draven he cared about. He would power word kill the Artificer, and his survival would prove he had received the blessing of Oluwana, making him immune to death spells. Except he had too many hit points for power word kill with his Constitution Amulet and Toughness feat, and I hadn't really planned for Cornello to fight to soften him up, which would have provoked them to go crazy, spending all their big spells, buffs, items, whatever, because it's a freaking Vampire King, and they needed stuff left to waste on a giant orc in a few minutes. And honestly, I hadn't planned all that well for how Cornello would bargain. Like, what diplomatic tack would he take, and what would he offer to Draven to become his new Baron Deathmore? It was all kind of a big mess. It was starting to escalate. I was like, what am I doing? This is dumb. So, as you can see above, I extricated us from that situation as quickly and firmly as possible. Then I had to do a whole bunch of work rearranging the script of the episode around this. I was going to take the later light beams in the distance encounter and slip it in fake Cornello's place before the battle, but I ran into some issues with that, messing around with the order and the flow of comments afterwards. So after recording the audio, I rearranged that part to what you actually got in the show. But I left in Angel running off to search that area of the wall, even though in the TDC version, the trees there haven't been sliced down. With or without that Cornello scene, I wasn't sure a couple episodes back when I started planning, I wanted to give a fun glimpse of what was actually going on outside the Cursed Forest in my own vague headcanon. Certain of Swain's lieutenants had been poking around across the border, and many of his expendable puppets, or loners from the Mind Hunters, had been fanning out in search of Rygax and friends. Of course, whatever the result, our heroes have no idea this is happening, and will have no idea, unless or until they emerge from Aldrum's forest of assholeness. But it was fun to show off some probing opening moves of a battle between Vampire Kings. A handful of my awesome patrons have downloaded the Vampire Kings game I made for Tabletop Simulator. Some parts have art, or at least cool snapshots I made on HeroForge.com, but the dozens and dozens of cards in the quest deck don't have pictures, just names and rules text. And at least a couple of those patrons were wondering, what is being represented by this card called Gary? Some kind of spirit shackle for combat? Which was hilarious to me, because I had already animated this post-credits battle long before the rest of the episode was done. Whatever Gary is, Swain invokes the name, draws a spiral in the air, and summons this creature which unleashes a massively destructive void beam, then grabs Aladon with its tentacles and begins draining the life out of it as the colossal scorp snake pulls Gary partway out of its sky portal. Based on the combat abilities and the little bit of tentacles and shell we saw, people very familiar with some of the later 3.5 edition monster manuals quickly pegged Gary as a very high challenge rating monster called a Spirax. Now, realistically, the Void Beam's only 120 feet long, or a 30-foot radius burst, and 20d6 damage couldn't actually one-shot a Ladon. But usually for action animation, you've got to tone down the hit points, and when a guy gets cut with a sword, they'd be injured if not dying, and as big and hit pointy as Ladons are, that beam is about as nasty as damage spells get. Plus, big creatures do not like being tentacle drained for 1d6 constitution. Now, how often can Swain summon Gary? Unclear. Should he have whipped out that move as soon as Rygax showed up at Balvan's mountain? Maybe, but Gary doesn't come out of that portal. Not willingly, anyway. Which means it's only attacking from a fixed location, and that 120-foot beam is shorter than the distance those phantasmal horses can run in a single move action. However, if you wanted to take down a fortress, Gary staring down out of the ceiling of the world is a vision of doom, and that beam recharges every 1d4 rounds, kind of like Dragon's Breath weapon. Given the poor survival rate of Ladons so far, these mighty, colossal, chimeric creatures with earth elemental movement powers, venomous bite, and sting, several people question, how many of these things does Cornello have? How are they replenished? Do they actually have to breed and grow to that size before being thrown away against freaking Gary? The short answer is that he controls about 3 of them. They do not respawn instantly, but he'll be back up to 3 in less than a month. In fact, based on the various shackles available to him, the Ladons could respawn even more quickly, but only one at a time, so losing all 3 the same day is, well, poorly played. This does hurt his defenses somewhat, but that's trivial compared to the loss of Baron Deathmore. My supporters on Patreon get extras videos about a week early so that I can answer a bunch of their questions in the final videos using completely arbitrary voices. Like these. Bessie asked,
Do we have a name for orc menopause? Is Untor the Talker old enough to be in this state?
I don't have a name for the orc thing. Other orcs eloquently describe it as, he has a beard. As for Untor, he is indeed old enough, but he's such a bizarre nonconformist that he actually shaves it off. Which is bonkers because the thing's so persistent he has to shave with his axe twice a day. But while the beard is known among orcs to be a mark of experience and wisdom, most orcs are at least a little contrarian, which helps account for the number of different hairstyles, tattoos, and other ways they try to differentiate themselves. And as such, there are a certain percentage of younger orcs whose reaction to being told what to do by an old beard is to do the opposite. And Untor figured out that by shaving it off, anyone with sense knew he was old and smart. But the young'uns was a little less stubborn about things when he told 'em what's what. Skyter97 asked,
If the party get out of the forest of asshole, would all the vampires come for them to kill Rygax? Or even work together to rid themselves of the hunter? They did work together in the early days, didn't they?
Rygax has been around a long time. Catching him out in the open has attracted a lot of attention from the local kings, but the others aren't going to drop their own schemes for this. If anything, they'd be trying to take advantage of Swain's and Cornello's distraction elsewhere on their borders. If they've even noticed all this. There were a ton of questions about how and why the Albtrom faked Kajord, how close was fake Kajord to the real thing, etc., from Patrick Rooney, Nine, Joshua Arnett, and Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin. To consolidate, obviously we can't know exactly the extent or limits of the Albtrom's knowledge. Can Al see the memories of the pawns trapped in their domain? Absolutely. When it comes to the future, Al has not proven particularly prescient in general. Clearly, they cannot see exactly how the heroes will react to these little games. They can only apply their considerable intellect and knowledge of the PC's past behavior to predict what they might do and how best to abuse those tendencies. As for the visions in the prior episode, it's hard to tell if they were made-up mental illusions or a Fey-like situational omniscience with limited scope sort of thing. But what about outside the bad place? Al's not omniscient, but they certainly have ways to obtain a lot of specific knowledge that they seek, probably beyond the capacity of most mortals. And the Albtrom does seem to pay attention to notable figures outside of their domain. Notable souls, you might say. Okay, so then how real was this fake Kajord? Not counting the part where he's a three-dimensional physical illusion projected by a two-dimensional shadow. When the Albtrom fakes a real person, one not present within their realm, whose memories they could plainly see, assuming there has been time to prepare, they seem able to access the memories and personality of even an external individual to a fairly disturbing degree, such that fake Kajord's reactions were probably pretty close to what the real orc would have done if thrust into the same unnatural situation. Kajord is aggressive, but not unreasonably so. He's curt and to the point, but also pretty patient, observant, even analytical when taking in new information, particularly when he finds himself in a new and unfamiliar situation where survival may depend on his observational skills. Then again, if Albtrom had a particular goal in mind for the puppet, that definitely has the potential to warp the duplicate's behavior. But when it comes to physical and magical abilities, it's a lot safer to assume that Al is capturing the spirit of the creature rather than the exact details. As I think was mentioned, at this point I can't remember what did and didn't make it into the final script, there is a perfectly normal psionic warrior power called expansion that lets the warrior grow 1 or even 2 size categories and or grow as a swift action, depending how high level they are and how many power points they are willing to spend. But 2 sizes is the max. There's no way to stack multiple growth effects. Growing 2 sizes from a single power is already quite rare in 3.5. So if the real Kajor does rely on that power to help him take on multiple opponents, it kind of makes sense that Al's Nightmare duplicate Kajor would grow in a similar, scarier, but not quite right fashion. So then we get to the why part of it. Why did the Albtrom create a fake Kajor rather than a fake dragon, or a monitor, or some ridiculous monster from the depths of the Underdark, or the Void Sky in the Fae? I think the answer comes through pretty clearly in the episode, if perhaps not explicitly. The party's past experiences with orcs have given them a willingness to parley with them, and even to sympathize with some of them, given how the orcs almost always seem much more reasonable and sane than their violent reputations and actions might suggest. And when you factor in the tremendous number of indirect connections they've had with Kajor, the ways his name has come up again and again throughout the campaign, he seemed like a very interesting choice to play around with. Joshua Smith asked,
Here's a rather old question I've been thinking on. If a Dark Ancient steals a Warforged body with spellcasting, given that Warforged casting seems to be at least partly manufactured, conjuring circuits, for example, can the Dark Ancient use the spellcasting of the body, assuming they have sufficient mental stats of the appropriate type, of course?
I would treat it as case by case, because some Warforged, like TR4, were indeed built for it. The wizard specialization may suggest that Itaran designers had trouble balancing the forces and that a bard school helped make the equations work. But it's hard to say how much of his casting was part of the design, and whether or how much some of it was exceeding specifications, and whether a DA could use that. Certainly, they wouldn't be able to use GE7's divine casting, which he was not designed for. He was built as an engineering assistant. But a Dark Ancient taking him over would gain access to most, if not all, of his memories. Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin asked, So are any of the high-powered orcs just orcs? It seems like they've all been made into puppets or become disguises for more eldritch things. And if they are so easily fooled, shouldn't dragons, vampires, or the KT be trying to use them for proxy wars? We've run into Del, who was really a fake orc. But this wasn't the real Kajor. The Varharan and his lieutenant were, in some sense, the orkiest of orcs, even if they were being manipulated and empowered by Delvash. And I'm not sure I would characterize encouraging the Varharan to take over the world as making him a puppet. Without that god's interference, he would quite likely have become an orc warlord and caused a lot of trouble for somebody anyhow. Carve's hosts, see the Shadowfell lore stream, yeah, they get a raw deal. But I think your perception is more a symptom of my wider problem of coming up with the lore, knowing what's normal for a given creature in my world, and thus becoming more interested in what is abnormal, leading to the exception often showing up before the rule. That's more my narrative foible than any failing of the orcs themselves. Alvera asked, Rapid fire, Albtrom versus X, who would win? I'll try off the top of my head. 1. Al invites a single vampire king who tries their hardest to kill him or her. What chance does the vampire king have of passing the trials in comparison to the party? Well, we can't compare to the party because we don't know how that ends. But this has happened at least twice, and both vampires got out. So in one sense, you could say 100% chance. But I don't think that speaks to how hard it was, physically and emotionally. They certainly had no interest in trying again, and Vlad impressed upon Cornello that he should never enter there. 2. What if Al invites all 5 vampire kings and queen, and they work together? In this ludicrous scenario, which wouldn't happen, there are only 2 possibilities as I see it. A, they went in together with a good plan and a lot of preparation and research, which allows them to win and accomplish something. Or B, their plan/prep was not so good, or they didn't intend to end up in this situation in the first place, in which case, there's no way such dire enemies could work together well against Al's carefully crafted attempts to drive them apart, and probably 2 or more of them would die. Maybe a TPK if Al was able to get it just right. 3. A single Vamp King storms the Albdrome without being invited. If a king wanders in uninvited, barring some extremely unusual artifact or intervention, the Albdrome could and would destroy them, though almost certainly a lot slower and more ceremoniously than that laid on. More demonstration of superiority, making sure the royal intruder felt their own weakness before the finality of the transaction. 4. All 5 vampire kings work together to attack the Albdrome without being invited. In this, again, unimaginable situation, one can imagine a scenario where they quested for insane artifacts first, with some kind of well-researched plan, and set out to rid the world of the Albdrome, and maybe something could be possible with all their massive powers combined. But much more likely it turns into 5 instances of number 3. 5. A full-fledged god, let's say Bahamut or Sirius, attacks the Albdrome in fully powered mortal form without being invited. Full-powered mortal form, like King Devonus, number 3. Sorry, you have encountered a category error. Now, if a true god went in as an avatar, assuming they can even do that anymore in the current age, then presumably Asmodeus would respond in kind, and now you have a big old biblical mess. 6. Last and least, a single level 1 drow fighter is invited. What are their chances of survival? It's very dependent on how resourceful and strong-willed the individual is, regardless of their experience level, gear, whatever. But probably 5%, even taking into account that if they were not some amazing potential hero in the making, Al wouldn't bother. Anything less is not worth their time. Willful G asked, how often do the Vampire Kings fight directly, face to face? I thought they mostly sent in their armies and lieutenants. I would say knockdown, drag out, to the death-ish battles are pretty rare, bearing in mind that the loser has a tendency to escape, even then. But somewhere on the continent, a couple kings meet probably almost every year. A probe, a clash, but almost always one of them wants it more. One is not willing to go all out over whatever brought them together to that place. And kind of like showdowns in no-limit hold'em poker. It's often better to back away with limited losses than to risk everything on a coin flip. But they do have to show up relatively often on the scale to their ancient lives, anyway, to stop another king from bullying their lieutenants, few of whom can put up even a decent holding action against an enemy monarch. In a sense, they should all be out there personally effing shit up all the time, but while strategically that would be smartest, and there were a couple periods like that, most of the time it's difficult for such wary, distant creatures to see the value of constantly rushing around, fighting at full power, etc. None of them really wants to live that way anymore, even though most of them hide that sentiment better than Swain does. Bessie also asked,
You mention often that Swain is insanely bored all the time, and it's clear that he is, so has he ever tried to deliberately shake things up in a way that isn't just a power grab? Has Swain ever thought of making a new life for himself somewhere else, or even intentionally dying?
Swain has tried lots of smaller-scale things to entertain himself, but he's also spent a horrendous amount of effort in his youth to purge his life of things that bothered and annoyed him. Which means, by this point, most things around his kingdom are either optimized, or he has decided not to care about them, because caring about things that he couldn't fix was annoying and there was no upside to it. So making radical changes or trying to get across the ocean to start fresh seems to him like a tremendous amount of work and frustration and a giant step backward. Plus, he's become pretty convinced that vampires don't have souls, and thus dying would mean utterly ceasing to exist. And he, quite rationally I'd say, feels that being mostly bored is preferable to being terrifyingly, permanently nothing. Joshua Pike asked, "Has there ever been a serious attempt by a powerful non-vampire group to try to take over a part of the Vampire King's domain? Like a group of old dragons wanting to get some shackles, or something like that?" Depends what counts as serious, but nothing else is known to be able to shackle spirits the way the Vampire Kings do. Though many other beings have ways to benefit from contacts with spirits, usually a lot less coercive ways. That all puts a serious crimp in the calculus of whether it's worth trying to face down all that power. If you just want spirits, they exist in other places, especially the Feywild. If you just wanted land, you'd probably pick someone else to fight for it. And if you wanted some specific artifacts or something else you could only get from one of the vampires, you'd be better off planning a heist than trying to actually defeat one of them. Joshua Pike also asked, "Do the Vampire Kings and Lieutenants use plane shift to get into an enemy's territory? Are they often seen in the Feylands, skulking about in trench coats?" Lieutenants have been known to try that sort of sneaky stuff, but the kings themselves have never been known to leave the Shadowfell. Even in the Dead Wars, the Atarans never reported sightings of them crossing over to the Feylands in person. They just sent other forces. Xylem asked, "Are the orcs genetically predisposed to being warlike? Or is it a purely cultural thing?" It's not genetic. They aren't demons or something. Purely cultural is closer, but of course, their culture grew from their environment, from the situations which arose when they were nearly wiped out by enemies and by the climate, and building upon lingering threads of their previous warlike culture. William Bailey asked,
"Would something on the level of a wish spell be able to restore Rygax's life force to pre-superform use levels? Obviously that couldn't be done very often, but it'd make a massive difference if it could be pulled off."
That sounds like something that might be possible. I would probably have it work, but have some cost or drawback that is not immediately obvious. Possibly an externality, a cost that didn't directly affect Rygax at all, maybe even had no obvious causal link to him, but which would eventually have haunting implications which the Wishcaster might not appreciate. Rinsaku Blade asked,
"Is Rygax's Archon form a unique ability granted only by Anku? Or do the other gods have their own somewhere in the world? Why is being the avatar of Anku such an important thing to the Albtrom and Asmodeus?"
The full gods can take proper avatar forms, far mightier than Rygax's temporary transformation. But at the same time, they're less likely to do so nowadays, at least outside of their individual shrines. As though they don't want to provoke one another by direct action. Demigods and their avatars, such as they are both less powerful, but also less concerned to the true gods. Nevertheless, it seems pretty intuitive that the Lord of Hell would take a greater interest in procuring the souls of heroes, and the more powerful, the better. But knowing that Anku can grant this, one does wonder if Raos and any other lesser deities bumbling around in the mortal realms have benighted their own mortal champions. Ultralight asked,
"Was Banshee's fall, described in the Shadowfell lore stream, in some way related to the Archon form's drawbacks? Because losing a third of their life force each time could very well be the thing that caused the previous champion of Anku to so dramatically lose her faith in the demigod."
One assumes that a transgression against Anku, a betrayal of his tenets, would involve trying to subvert death in an unnatural way, most likely for herself, perhaps after spending 2 or 3/3 of her life force in furtherance of Anku's will, or for a dying loved one. And a champion of Anku would, by necessity, possess quite a lot of knowledge about ways and means of unscrupulously evading death. Alternatively, in such situations, she might have chosen not to betray what she stood for, might have done exactly what Anku requires, and suffered the consequences, letting a loved one die whom she could have broken the rules to save, or dying or being crippled herself by invoking the Avatar form. And having done the right thing, according to her faith, one could imagine her then falling into despair, questioning everything. Muttman asked,
About Al's domain, how did it come to be? Is it static, or would it move with him if, say, he wanted to relocate to another place in the Shadowfell, or even in another plane?
Their realm is static. Part of the power comes from that limitation. As for its creation, back in ancient times, when Vecna attacked Ioun, and the two gods became locked in eternal combat over the source of all magic in the Astral Sea, the titanic energies they unleashed buffeted the world. Those waves of power crashing against reality created echoes of the world. One echo born of Ioun's wild, curious, and generous magic, and one echo born of Vecna's deceptive, selfish, parasitic energies. But this was just a side effect of their titanic battle, a battle that would decide the fate of the universe and all beings within it. The creation of these two planes was not intentional, except in that passive way in which each god's will and desires work upon every particle of the universe within their spheres of power. And because this massive act of creation was not intentional in the way mortals think of intentions, and because it was not managed or directed in the way mortals think of such things, there was a time when those two new worlds, new planes, remained soft, flexible. Their still-forming realities were malleable. The other gods, of course, stepped in to impose their own wills, but that very softness of the new reality, and its difference from the world in which they had already established themselves, meant their powers were also softer there, initially. And so many of the ephemeral spirits of the Astral Sea drifted down and took advantage of this new space, this new emptiness, and made homes for themselves as well, shaping and being shaped by their new environments. These spirits, individually and collectively, affected the development of the Shadowfell and the Feywild in countless ways. Many of them did so passively, just by existing and going about their new lives, but others took a very active hand, tentacle, or other appendage, in forming their own little home, shelter, or area, pervading their little sliver of the plane with their own concept of morality, of beauty, of time. As time passed, the gods receded somewhat, and these echo planes hardened into more permanent forms that we know now. But the role these spirits had in co-creating their realities left some of them with great power over specific areas or aspects of the new worlds. There were, however, a couple of deities who had been left out of this process. Before even Ioun and Vecna left the world behind, Asmodeus and Amara were already distant gods on the far side of the Astral Sea, ruling the hells and the heavens respectively. Asmodeus in particular resented how little power he could wield in the formation of the new worlds. And so, when the gold rush began, the great influx of spirits to fill the empty lands, Asmodeus called one denizen of the Astral Sea before him, a trickster spirit who had misled many others, often stealing some of their power, other times out of pure mischief, and often unknowingly interfering with the works of the Lord of Nightmares himself. Asmodeus loomed over this spirit, who had taken what he himself wished to take, and thwarted paths which the god had tried to lay down, and he made an offer.
You have displeased me, but have also shown great skill at manipulating the fates of others. So you will leave the astral behind, never to return. You will live forevermore within my hells. However,
the voice of Asmodeus boomed to this quivering spirit,
If you so choose, I will give you a sliver of my power to tend. And with this sliver, if you tend it well, you can forge a new hell for me. One of your own creation, down in the world. Tend the sliver of the green flame, and you may live in a hell of your own making, and therein rule under me. Or you can stay here.
Choosing between power and servitude, or despair and defiance, the spirit accepted the new role graciously, lodging this fragment of a true god's power in the Shadowfell and, bound thus in space and by the ancient laws of the gods, they began their trickster work anew, warping or ending the fates of other beings, and using the difference between what was left and what could have been to build this new bastion of hell. The Albtrome was so successful in this new, molten world that finally Asmodeus had a foothold, one whose expanding borders were halted only when a number of spirits saw the evil and its potential to consume much of the world, and so they chose to give up their own hopes and dreams, using the power of that sacrifice to surround and bind the realm of the Albtrome within its current limits, locking that malevolent force in, for the most part. And lastly, apologies to 3C273 that I can't call the episode Shadow of the Calorxis, but, spoiler issues. For my Lore Master patrons, $4 and up, I just released a little action story titled A Few Minutes in the Shadowfell. It's just some vampire lieutenants mentioned in the Shadowfell lore stream fighting each other. Here's a brief sample. The vertical slits of Carve's red predator eyes focused on the much smaller Ratman, while the large blood-red gem in his forehead glowed ominously.
Nobody steals from Lockhart,
he stated, his low voice old, wary, and cold. As Radahn drew his other sickle, one in each hand, his eyes flicked down to the magic pouch on his belt, as though to make sure it were still there. But he dared only the briefest glance away from his unexpected foe.
Bad. The daimyo warned me not to risk fighting this one. He's out of my league. Do I call for help? No, I don't have to defeat him. I just have to slip past to lose him. Then I can return this relic to my king without the risk of disappointing my master.
With a thought, Radahn called upon one of his powers of invisibility, and as soon as he faded from view, he bolted westward toward the cluster of standing stones to his right. Carve's eyes, those strange vertical slit irises, never left him, despite his invisibility spell. That was little surprise from another lieutenant of a vampire king. But the speed with which the orc moved parallel to him did surprise Radahn.
I'm sure I'm still quicker than him. I must be, but not by nearly the margin I had thought. Pad.
Yeah, so it's basically a dozen pages of fighting. The kind of stuff I can imagine, but couldn't hope to do justice to in animation. And if I tried, it would take like a year, so that's not happening. Yeah, so I put out the story, I've GM'd again a bit, non-D&D, a weird comedy horror thing. We had fun in the first week, but we'll see if it goes anywhere worthy of making a video or two. And I'm hard at work on the next TDDC episode, including a Legendy bit I'll probably extract into a separate Legends video, because why not? We'll see if changing around the production order, which is why this extras is later than usual, gets the episode done any faster, but as always, I'm pretty sure I'm too slow for words. Thanks again to all my patrons for your infinitely thesaurusable support, with a special shout out to Aurelius, Aus, Bedimir, Bigrin, Karnlin, Critical Hit 20, Aether Mordu, Dimon, Duckburg, Erlef, Sanguine, General M.O., Fey Grossroads, Fireborn, Fright Knight, Gorfine, Hakum, Havoc, 9, John, Lieutenant Red, Lonito, Lord Abon, Mad Brewer, Zach, Malice, and Desh, MG3D, Norgrin, OI1, Oldenman, Pedriga, Rooney, Pontus, Prism Cat, Naramar, Ulfist, Repmok, Stand Up Man, Skyter 97, Starfall, Sildari, Cygax, Tambu and June, Toshiro 7, Volkfang, Valis, W, Ace, Soul, Warsaw, Woodley, Zombie, members of the organization. Not gonna lose my organization. You guys gotta stop encouraging this kind of thing. You gotta stop encouraging me to sing.